You're not going to grow by studying the Bible. You are not going to grow by studying the Word.
Hello, welcome along to the teaching series The Jesus That John Knew. Thank you for joining me again, and I hope you're enjoying our little ramble through John chapter 15. And it is turning into something of a ramble, isn't it? We've been here for a few weeks now. But I finished last week saying I wanted to have a think about this business of how do the grapes that have been abiding on the vine, those fruitful lives that we can think of, how do they become wine? What's the process that happens? Well, you know, if you're going to make good wine, what you need to use is the very best grapes. I don't know a great deal about winemaking, but I tell you, the process is fascinating to look at. Not being a drinker, I don't really appreciate the taste of wine either, but nonetheless, the principle here seems to me to be absolutely fascinating. It's said that the very best grapes that you can use for winemaking is a grape called vinifera. And I like this because the vinifera grapes are European in origin, which of course will come as no surprise to you. But in all seriousness, they are known as being the most noble of grapes. And these grapes are used for the noble wines, the Chardonnays and the Sauvignons and so forth. And what happens is that they are, if you like, for me, the kind of grace grapes is what I want to say. Now, you can make lesser wine and cheaper wine with religious grapes, but religious grapes will just produce plonk. But those of you who know about wine, those of you who know about the quality of wine, know that there is a difference. And I'm a Philistine on this point. I can only tell you the difference in price, but I can tell you there's a reason for the difference in price. That much I will know. So what happens is that we began, do you remember the discussion about the Scion? And we began all the way back there, and we need to just step back for a moment. That what we saw this cutting away from the vine. Usually, we know this is when we're making these good grapes, we use this vinifera, and it's grafted onto another root system. And so what happens is that these grapes, these particular grapes that we're looking at, the good ones, grow it best in cooler climates. The cooler the climate, the better. And the quality of the grape depends on a number of variables, and they're important. Number one, it depends on the quality of the soil. Now that's interesting. Number two, it depends on the quality of it depends on the weather, the nature of the weather, and the conditions where the grapes are grown. So if you go down to the great Napa Valley or some places like this, you'll see that the miles and miles and miles of these vineyards are in perfect conditions for growing. But of course, the moment you say that the grapes, the condition of the grapes is contingent upon the type of soil, immediately you're going to say to yourself, wait a minute, we know something about that, the parable of the sower. Absolutely. Now remember, the story goes like this. A farmer, the Bible says, went out to sow his seed. Firstly, it was his seed. Important, his seed. And as he was scattering the seeds, some fell, as you know, along the path. Some, and that fell along the path was trampled on, do you remember? And the birds of the air came and ate it and took it up. Some fell on the rock, and when it came up, the plants withered because they had no moisture. Other seed fell amongst thorns, the Bible says, which grew up and it was choked. The plants were choked. And the scattering of this is all about how the quality of the soil that the seed finds itself in. That's the variable. Other seed, the Bible says in Luke, it fell upon good soil, and it came up and it yielded a massive crop. And we know that that's the principle, obviously, of multiplication. We understand that. Now, this is the meaning Jesus said of the parable. He said that those along the path are the ones who hear. And then the devil, he comes and he takes away that which they've heard. He snatches it from their hearts almost, so that they can't believe and be saved. Those who are on the rock, Jesus says, they are the ones who receive the word with tremendous joy, but they don't have any roots. And because they don't have any root, they believe for a while, but then when testing comes, they fall away. The seed that falls among the thorns, well, what happens there? It stands for those who hear the message, and they go away, but then they're choked by the worries of this life, and they fall away. But the seed that falls among the good soil stands for those who are noble, Jesus says, and good in heart, who hear the word and they retain it, and by persevering, the words abiding, they produce a crop. Alright, well now, let's not let this pass immediately before you start thinking to yourself, oh my goodness, are there people that are in and out, good people, bad people? No. The story is about the story is about the condition of the soil. There are times when you and I are in a place where someone can give you something, and something so good and so right, but yet you're on a different path, and the birds of the air can snatch away what's been dropped into your heart. You know, I've seen people, when they hear the grace message, instead of doing what I would do, which is, you know, do cartwheels and somersaults with joy, do what Tyndall said, hearing the good, glad, happy news, I would jump for joy. No, they don't, because what's happened to them is that they're hearing the messages dropped into their hearts, but it lands on the path, and the devil's able to come and just steal it away from them. Other people, you tell them about the freedom that is theirs in Christ, and you tell them about the glory of our message, but for them what happens is that their thorns are growing up around them, and the troubles of this life just simply chokes them. They can't move through with it. Other people, and God knows I've seen enough of these over the years, they're the rock, and you speak the word of grace to them and they just spring up all over the place, they jump to it, but you know, because they have no root, soon it dies and it withers. But there comes a moment, there comes a perfect time in the affairs of a man where he hears the word of grace, he hears the word of life, and he's good soil. And the only good soil is the dead soil. I don't mean a fallow ground. I just mean someone who's dead to his self-effort, someone who's done with the law, someone who's done with religion. In fact, the fallow ground of his life has been dug up, and he's ready for the new harvest of life. He is Hosea's man, actually. And he's now ready to receive that seed, and that seed is buried deep within his heart. There's nothing to interfere with it. It gets deep within his heart. And when the troubles come and the thorns grow, it doesn't choke him. When the birds come and the devil comes, they can't steal it away, because it's locked down deep within inside of him. And when those things happen, it's just very, very wonderful. Well, now, the seed is sown, and the grapes must now grow. And it's important that you can't take unripe grapes and expect to make good wine with them. If there was ever something that we needed to hear in our day, it's the words of Martin Luther. What was his name? He said Martin Luther King. I didn't mean Martin Luther King. I meant Martin Lloyd-Jones, who was the great preacher that used to be at Westminster Chapel here in London. And Martin Lloyd-Jones used to say, there's nothing worse that can happen to a young man than he becomes successful before he's ready. Listen, there is a season for everything. And when you're not ready, you're not ready. And the worst thing you can do is try and make good wine out of unripe grapes. The goodness, or the richness, or the ripeness, should I say, of the cluster of grapes is judged by something that's called the Brix scale, B-R-I-X scale. And what that does is it rates the grape's sweetness. And it's a very interesting process. But basically what it does is it's able to measure the percentage of sugar that's in a solution. In actual fact, what it does, if you want to make the spiritual parallel, which I do, is it's able to measure how much of self is left in you. Because as long as there's a self that's left inside of you, there is no hope that you're going to be sweet to the taste. There is just no hope of that. And so the spiritual version of the Brix scale, if you like, would be, let's say, are you still living from acceptance? Are you still living wishing to have the approval of men? Because if you're living for approval and you're not living as an approved one, then you're not ready to be taken down. You're not ready to be used for good wine. Not to say you won't be good wine, it's just to say you're not ready to be good wine at that stage. And after picking the grapes, they must be then separated from the stem. And immediately when you start thinking about these processes of this pulling away, there seems something about this in this life of discipleship that you kind of just get comfortable. Can you imagine? Then you are on this cluster and you just lock together in this beautiful little cluster of grapes. You've seen them in the store, and they're just like little buddies, they're little cliques of grapes. But then there comes a point where they have to be cut away from the stem, and each of the grapes have to be ripped away, literally that. And then what happens is that those grapes, having been then departed, having been pulled off of the stem, they then have to be crushed. Now what's up with that? I produce beautiful fruit, I produce this wonderful fruitful life, and then you rip me away from the comfort of my home, or you rip me away from the comfort of my church community, or you rip me away from the comfort of my work, or whatever it might be that I'm involved in. And you strip me bare, and then you crush me. I don't know as I like where this is going, but this seems to be the way of it, because if I want to produce something better, then there almost must come this point of death. And the crushing releases the must inside of you. And for making wine, what happens is you have to press the juice out of the skins. You press every last bit. So step number one then is that the good grapes, those wonderful grapes, are grown until they're ripe. Very important. So you grow them until the point of maturity, and then once they've reached the point of maturity, you cut them off. You break them away. Now, having done that, and having crushed them, and having squeezed out all of the life in them, the next thing for you to do is to begin the fermentation process. And the fermentation process is the process by which the juice, the fruit juice, is converted into wine. And now we introduce yeast and sugar and so on. It turns into alcohol and so forth. Now, having been separated, and this is important, having been separated, the grapes, the juice, now has to have a period where it can rest. So it's gone, if you like, through that trauma of separation. Now it comes to a time where it just rests. And it rests under refrigeration, interestingly enough. And what happens is that the resting process prevents fermentation. It's a natural law, it's very interesting. Because the danger is that there is the potential now for the juice to become vinegar, gall, religion. But it needs to rest. I think it's very interesting, and I think it's very significant that the very last act of religion, in Jesus' time, was for Jesus when he cried out, "I'm thirsty." And they offered him up a sponge that was filled with vinegar, the sour grapes of religion. And believe me, there's nothing like religion to make you sour. It's gall. But now the juice rests. And it goes through this process that's called a maceration period. And what happens is that period is a period where they extract all of the compounds from it. And what happens now is that there's this kind of mixing and mashing that goes on. I mean, it's an extraordinarily violent process, but the idea is to extract all of what they call the tannins out of the grapes. And these are and then what happens is that the tannins are a kind of a bitter, mouth-drying substance that's found in the skins and the stalks and the pips of grapes. They have to be, it's all got to come out. Because what happens is, although the tannins act as a preservative, but they've got to be literally, what's happened is they've got to be lifted out of the fruit. It's very important. And tannins are a kind of type of the law, incidentally. And so now, what's happened in this life process of these cluster of grapes so far is this. Number one, they've abided in order to bear fruit. Having borne fruit, they've then been divided, they've been cut away, they've been crushed, and now they've been put in this resting place. But they're moving to this new point, and the new point is that they're now preparing for the new wine, these new wine skins. Now, needless to say, you know that you can't put new wine into an old wineskin. And of course, do you see how the metaphor is beginning just to build itself up? It's not, it's effortless stuff, really. And these new wineskins seem to me to be a picture of the church. Because what we know definitely is that you've got to keep this wine in a new and a good container. Again, going back to Luke, Luke says that you can't put new wine into an old wineskin because you'll burst them both. You have to have brand new wineskins. And I find myself constantly coming back to this thought, because time and time again, I'm saying to myself, we've got to get the wineskin, we've got to get this wineskin of the spiritual community right if we're going to make some sense out of this message of ours. It's really very, very important. But let me not dwell on that, because I could talk about that forever, and that's not the point. But the point is that there comes now, having got this new wineskin, we come to this place of we have to have it stored. And so what happens is that the new wine is placed into the storage, the new wineskin, and it can be stored there for 3 or 4 months or several years before we bottle it. But then there comes a point when we want to bottle the wine, and now what happens is the wine is decanted from the wineskin, maybe the church, maybe some kind of community, who's to say, and it's bottled. And now what happens is you've got this bottle, and here's the thing. Imagine if you've gone through all of this process, you've gone through all of this growing and abiding and bearing fruit, to being cut down, to being crushed, to being poured out, to having all of these tannins extracted out of your life, and then you're poured into this new wineskin thing. You're left there, you're pushed away into the dark, and then finally you're bottled. And then somebody takes the bottle and says, "Fantastic," and then puts it in a wine cellar and just leaves it there. And you might be sitting in a wine cellar. You might be sitting in God's wine cellar all of your life. But then the final stage comes, the pouring. And it seems to me that the pouring is the moment of destiny. It seems to me the pouring is the moment when it all begins to hang together. And Paul says in Philippians, "I am being poured out." But there's that moment where, literally, imagine a whole row of bottles of wine, be it in a store, be it in a cellar, whatever you pick your thought. And the Lord reaches in and picks it out and says, "Yep," picks that one, unscrews it, and pours you out for the life of another. And someone drinks of you, drinks in the exquisite taste of this life of the vine. It's a fabulous process. And that's the thing we're involved in. That's what we're doing. That's where we are. That's why we're here. And I don't know. I don't quite know how I want to finish this, but I guess I want to finish it by saying that the whole purpose of the journey is that we might bear fruit for the benefit of others. We might bear fruit that could be lives that are poured out for other people's benefit. Oh, if we ever got it, if we ever understood it, if we ever really grabbed a hold of it. I am the vine. You are the branches. Abide in me and I in you. Apart from me you can do nothing, but if you abide in me you bear much fruit. But the purpose of the fruit is that we may be a blessing to other people. Well, I feel I've done a clumsy job today, but I hope you've got the principle of what I'm trying to say. Allow yourself to be poured out. And there is the final thought, that when Jesus comes in the Last Supper, he says two things. This is my body, broken for you. Do this in memory of me. And then he says, this is the blood of the new covenant. And pours out the wine and says, do this in remembrance of me. And the great message that those of us who are in the Grace community need to grasp is this. We are to do these things in remembrance of him. To be broken and to be poured out. Cheers. God bless you. Bye for now.
How many of us really believe God? How many of us truly believe God? Or how many of us in our darker moments, in our moments of credit crunch, in our moments where life seems to crowd in on us, where our circumstances seem to overwhelm us, instead of believing God, put our trust in ourselves? You see, because the real nature of this thing, what this whole thing is really going to be about when we come right down to the wire is, I know you believe in God, but do you believe God? Do you believe that God will do what he said he'll do? Because if you believe, you will wait. Those who wait upon the Lord will renew their strength.